Welcome to a new episode of Manage to Retain, where I talk about issues around business for employees, your customers, recruiting, retention, productivity, and profitability. And I do it with my friends, Sherri and Lou. Listen in, you might get a few tips here on how to do leadership better in your business.
All right. Here's the topic on our new episode of Manage to Retain that I feel like is something that I have suffered through a bit and made a lot of mistakes around it. And it's this word that I think is communicated quite often. It's the word communication. So many times I have always believed that I just need to communicate to my people better, but I never took the time to actually understand what that means. And I want to get a couple of thoughts from my friends Sherri and Lou in a second here, but just wanted to check in. Sherri and Lou, how are you all doing today?
Doing good. Doing good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here as leadership coaches who help leaders lead with more influence. There's two words that come to mind when I think about communication, because communication is a nebulous topic, and I've tried to just communicate more and more and more. But if I'm telling my people, I want them to go right, but I keep saying left, it doesn't matter how many times I say it, they're still not going right because I haven't communicated effectively. I've just communicated efficiently. How does that sit with you? How does that resonate with you? Do you see that same sort of problem?
Yeah, it's actually it's been an issue for many decades. We are still today getting the same types of requests for effectively communicating, especially with new supervisors, new leaders, with their frontline workers to increase their production or increase their productivity. And it's something that's been a constant struggle for decades. And you think that with all that out there, that we're not the only ones that talk about this, that we don't really have to talk about it anymore. But unfortunately, as long as the human race is in existence, we are going to struggle with identifying what effective communication really is.
Yeah, and I think about this, and I want to go to an example here so we can kind of tease this thing apart a little bit and understand what that effective communications as a leader versus efficient communications as a leader. Because I think of efficient as just cranking the wheel harder and more often, and effective meaning I just crank it one time and it works the way it's supposed to. And here's the thing that I see all the time, especially in the marketing world. It's the idea that you need to tell somebody 7 times before they will think about it or understand it. I call BS on that. If I say it right to the right audience in a way that they can receive and understand and act on, I should only have to say it once because it resonates with them. And I feel like that's an example of effective as opposed to saying it 7 times. Does that resonate with you all as well?
Sure. And it's sometimes not about saying it, right? Communicating it effectively is not always about verbally saying something, right? Like you see using the marketing technique of 7 times. That's why we see or hear commercials over and over and over again until finally, like maybe I should call that number if it even relates. But as leaders, when we're leading our team of people, does it not seem a little bit redundant if we're having to tell somebody or explain to somebody or a team over and over and over again the same thing? If we're doing that, then we're doing it wrong, and we need to reevaluate that. We're not marketing to our employees. We're trying to create and develop producing employees.
And to understand the employees as well, which can go into what language do they understand. And that is a key as well, especially as new managers, or if you're in the C-suite level, you have to understand where your team is and where they are as individuals and not a machine.
Well, hold on a second. I think we've discovered something here. In order to be able to communicate effectively with somebody, you need to understand how they're going to hear it. Oh, wow. That's a powerful insight there. That's free, and you heard it here. So here's what I'd like to do. Sherri and Lou, I'd like to share my screen of an example of a real life person. We've changed some of the names, changed the name. And I'd like to talk about who this person is just based on what we're seeing from the data inside of a company just represented on this graph. And I'd like to talk about maybe what sort of like an efficient kind of conversation would be as opposed to an effective conversation would be. And maybe people kind of listening in can see how they're fundamentally different. And you don't have to say it 7 times. That's my hope, at least. Give me a moment here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'd love to see what you all think here. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
So we've got this person named Jerry Albert right here, and how effective Jerry is. You'll see on a scale of 1 to 100, Jerry's got a 58 out of 100. That's his overall score across all these different dimensions here. And these dimensions are all presented on this graph as well. And just think of it like this. On the outside edge of this graph, you are getting 100 on high appointments service. So meeting the quota of appointments to be serviced, Jerry is doing, in this case, a fantastic job. He's got 100 out of 100 on that dimension. But you can see some other dimensions. Jerry's not doing so well. And on low customer cancels, actually, he's got a 29 out of 100 on that dimension. So not as effective in that regard. And you can kind of see this blue area represents Jerry, and this gray area represents the average employee at that organization. And it's color-coded over here. It kind of shows you that the low not service rate and the low reservice percentage are the places where Jerry is struggling most.
Mm-hmm.
Sherri and Lou, talk to me about, if we see the average here, there's this gray area, I might suggest that is telling me what the really efficient communications are really stressing, right? That's what everybody's hearing over and over again. That's a one size fits all. That message has been received 7 times over. Whereas the effective communication is the stuff that Jerry just happens to get, and he understands it well. And that's resonating with Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
How does that sit with you all? Is that making some sense in terms of how the two conversations are maybe different?
Well, sure. If you think about how we all work, we're going to perform well in areas that we fully understand, that we have been fully equipped to do, and we're fully confident in. Which means that in some way along the way, we have been effectively communicated to, whether it's our learning or whether it's working with or being guided to or mentored by. That's just natural. So by looking at this, we can identify where the communication, the effectiveness needs to be focused on. What do we need to focus on, in this case with Jerry, to be able to understand where his gaps might be? With that type of connection with Jerry and understanding what it is that he needs to hear will help us then understand, well, how can we then get Jerry to produce? How can we get him to increase these numbers? We're not going to do that without first identifying how he needs to hear this effective communication.
So this is really interesting. Here, let me play back to you what I'm just hearing. For example, this low reservice percentage. So you don't want your employees to go back and do the same job for your customers again, doing it twice when it should be done one single time. In this case, Jerry is actually at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of his performance there. In this case, he's got a 12 out of 100. So he is actually doing lots of rework of the work that was supposed to be done. So what I'm hearing from what you just said is, by understanding that about Jerry and the fact that whatever you're saying along these lines around the low reservice percentage, that message is not coming through crystal clear to Jerry. And this data, in this case, this graph here, shows you that the light bulb hasn't clicked on with Jerry. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's something wrong with Jerry. It's in between the supervisor and Jerry that connection is not being made. Words are being said, but the communication is not happening. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
It's true. And, and just as to pull as an example, it's very common, especially coming from a sales background, that how many times that the sales is the focus, right? Sell the product, whatever that it is. We need numbers. This is the metrics that we have to hit. And then the other messages that are important, like telling stories, putting it personal, have your tone. These people are people, not just a machine, right? Like sell solutions. So that messaging gets lost because there's such a hard focus on numbers, numbers, numbers. That is very common, unfortunately. But we as leaders, at least we got to change that script a little bit. Numbers are important, hands down, but we also have to understand the other messaging that is just as important and try to find that harmony between the two.
And I think, let me play that back to in the way I heard that. There are influencing factors on the outcomes, right? And those influencing, by understanding a little bit about how Jerry is showing up every day here in this case, you can see what's influencing the behaviors that he is exhibiting. And if you can understand what those influences are in his behavior, you can start to say, so let me tell you the implication of doing this way. Can I suggest something else for you to consider changing? And I mean, it's all about creating that clarity and alignment. And for him to realize that, look, I'm getting lots of appointments done, but the reason why is because I'm going back and reservicing people, and I'm doing maybe twice the work when I could be doing twice the revenue instead. Right.
Which will most likely help reduce the gap in some of these other service areas, the low customer cancels and all these other areas as well. See, we look at communication as connecting. Let's think of it that way. Okay, it's about connecting with people. So we do a lot of training on this topic with how to connect, not just communicate, because people can communicate, but how are you connecting where you get effective production?
You look at things holistically too.
Right. You look at the whole person.
Yeah, the whole person.
Look at an example with the numbers connect the dots sheet. Right. We know what I'm talking about, right? Connect the dots and you have a picture you really can't see. Now, if I was to take that, instead of connecting the dots, I just kind of went around them, it's not really going to be the right picture. And so what happens a lot of times is we don't really fully connect those ideas and dots for our frontline workers. What we're doing is we're kind of going around that because we don't fully understand how they need to hear it. If we can fully understand how they need to hear it, now we can do very specific strategic connecting that's going to allow that picture to be a lot more clear for them.
Yeah. I'm going to stop sharing here. But what I'd like to do is there are 10 principles that you all use to coach and guide leaders to be more effective in how they reach out. Based on what we just talked about today, what would you say are the principles that might apply here that can kind of ground them as to how communication is about this underlying concept to make you more effective?
Well, there's a few of them, but there's two of them specifically that I believe relate here. Because in order to connect with people, you have to value them. Right? You can't add value to somebody unless you value them first. That's just the way it works. So in order to really do that, we have to understand, okay, well, in order to add value to someone that I value, which you should in your team, the principle of the nurture principle is the one I want to mention right away. The nurture principle is we want to feed and water them, right? Like a plant. We got to feed and water the plants. That's what we call it. We don't just, they're going to eventually start withering away, as we just saw in this case, where there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's never too late. We need to begin nurturing that. Too many leaders today will observe that withering in their people and begin to, instead of looking at the process that they're doing with their people, will begin to blame them instead. And so it's essential that we provide the needed nurturing for them so that they can grow, and that connection then begin to build to an effective communication style. The second one is the time principle. It takes time. And you've got to take the time to do it. That's what that comes down to. So don't buy into the myth that you don't have the time to nurture your people, because you did. That's a myth, right? We all have the same amount of time. It's how you use it.
And at the very least, just to add in too, think about these principles, that it's going to save you. If you're all about the bottom line, if you're listening to this, like, well, I need to make money and we need to make profit. Well,
which is important.
But if you don't want to see retention and your people constantly walking out the door, you might as well see dollar signs just walking out your door, right? This is actually in the long run will save you money because you're investing in your people and just taking a time to connect with them. It doesn't have to be all this fancy stuff. Don't make it complicated. Us humans, we make things complicated, and it does not need to be complicated. Take the time, take the nurturing, and really look at the people that you have, that all you have to do is just kind of guide them, and they're going to be in the right direction, which will be a very happy environment, which will be a very productive as well as a revenue making company.
Just do 10%.
Yeah.
What could you do if you could increase your production with your team by just 10%? It could change everything. And all you've got to do is take the time to make it happen. 10%.
And I think the point that I'd like to drive home today is this idea that communication is not about talking more and making more noise. It's actually about understanding where they're coming up with, like that person we saw, I think it was Jerry here we saw on screen, understanding where they are today and what they are able to hear from you and what they're not able to hear or not receiving very well from you. And communication is about taking that and then flavoring your conversation so that you can help and nurture them as a leader, because that's what makes you look effective in my mind.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, Sherri and Lou, thanks. Hopefully those who've listened in got some real value out of this. Hopefully some practical tips in terms of how you can talk to your people to get some results and some actions that lead to a better bottom line and a more sustainable business. Sherri and Lou, thank you so much for your time.
You got it.
You got it.
Thanks, Vinay.
Bye-bye.